It is a nightmare vision first told 100 years ago. It still captures our imagination today. He came from Transylvania, drawn by an insatiable appetite for blood and a taste for young women. His children come in every incarnation. There are vampires for a night. There are vampires for real. And then there is the vampire for the ages, Dracula. More than a century after his creation, Dracula endures. When the Irish author Bram Stoker finished Dracula in 1897, he thought he'd written a good horror story in the Gothic tradition, perhaps even a great one. But Bram Stoker had invented far more than a memorable monster. He had created an icon. On its surface, Dracula is a simple, if lurid, tale of good versus evil. Count Dracula, a blood-sucking vampire, sets out from Transylvania to England in search of new victims. Dracula has a taste for young English women, and when he indulges his appetites, their men fight back. It is a battle of supernatural against earthly, the corrupt against the virtuous.
I am Dracula.
Dracula has sunk his teeth into popular culture like no other monster before or since.
Dracula has become one of the most mediagenic fictional characters of the 20th century. And I think that's because he can be all things to all people. You know, he's a kind of a consummate politician. He represents everything we want and everything we fear simultaneously.
From the 1922 classic Nosferatu, to Bela Lugosi, to Christopher Lee, Dracula has inspired hundreds of films.
Prince of Darkness, I have returned to destroy you.
To resist him is useless. To rise against him is futile.
I'm just a sweet transvestite from transsexual Transylvania.
James Hart wrote the screenplay for Francis Ford Coppola's 1992 film.
Welcome to my home.
The novel so stunned me because it was so completely different than anything I had ever been led to believe about Dracula. I mean, it was erotic, it was sexual, it was moist, it was totally unlike anything I'd ever seen in the films. It wasn't about a guy in a tuxedo. This is about a warrior, and it completely changed every feeling I ever had about how cheesy and how funny and how goofy and how kind of camp Dracula was. Nobody apparently had ever read the book, and it was exquisite. So that's when I started saying, can we do Dracula?
The novel opens with a young English lawyer, Jonathan Harker, traveling through the mysterious landscape of Eastern Europe. A certain Count Dracula has recently purchased property in London, and Harker carries paperwork associated with the sale. His destination? Castle Dracula, Transylvania. As he travels deeper and deeper into the Transylvanian countryside, Harker keeps a journal, noting the foreign people and customs.
The impression I had was that we were leaving the West and entering the East. all day long we seemed to dawdle through a country which was full of beauty of every kind. Sometimes we saw little towns or castles on top of steep hills, such as we see in old missals.
Harker is the rational Westerner journeying into a world of religion and superstition. Elderly villagers discover his destination and beg him not to proceed.
For your mother's sake.
It is the first sign that something more than a client awaits at Castle Dracula. At the Borgo Pass, Harker is picked up by the Count's carriage and driven into the night. The clock chimes midnight. The carriage pulls up to the castle. Harker knocks at the door.
And of course, once Jonathan walks over that threshold and starts the journey into the darker side of the self, then I think his life changes. It's the event on which the whole plot moves, if you wish, and nothing is the same again for Jonathan, for Dracula, for any of the characters, for the reader, or for the history of vampire fiction, because ever since that, of course, the vampire has been inviting us in.
When we enter Castle Dracula, we're not just walking into a building in Transylvania. We're entering Bram Stoker's mind, and by extension, the whole shadow world that was late Victorian culture. All the things that couldn't be acknowledged by daylight, but within the context of a potboiler Victorian horror thriller, could be approached without consequence.
The novel is a Rosetta Stone of Victorian anxieties. Anxieties about sexuality, disease, the changing role of women, the new theory of evolution, and the arrival in England of foreigners. Harker goes about his legal business, but his client's strange attributes are difficult to ignore. One evening, as he shaves, Harker is faced with the realization that his host is far from human.
Suddenly, I felt a hand on my shoulder and heard the Count's voice saying to me, "Good morning." I started, for it amazed me that I had not seen him, since the reflection of the glass covered the whole room behind me.
He explores the castle and makes another disturbing discovery. The castle is a prison, and Harker, its only prisoner. When Harker, searching for a way out of the castle, discovers the Count asleep, he is faced with the full horror of his entrapment. Count Dracula is a vampire.
The particular image of the vampire we have rises out of Slavic folklore, and it has its origins in the real lives of real people who, in an age when you could not tell when people were absolutely dead, sometimes buried people who were simply in a catatonic stupor, and who then came out of their stupor and tried to claw their way out of the grave, and were then found with blood on their fingernails and blood on their lips as they were trying to break through the coffins in which they were enclosed.
Vampires often appear in mythology as shapeshifters, and Stoker's vampire is no exception. Harker witnesses Dracula's exit from the castle.
I feel the dread of this horrible place overpowering me. I am in fear, in awful fear. There is no escape for me.
One of the most revealing images in Dracula is that moment where Jonathan Harker looks down and sees Dracula emerge from the window and crawl down the face of his castle, becoming a lizard or a bat, literally going down the evolutionary scale. There can't be a more perfect image to sum up the Victorian anxiety about the meaning of Darwin, this blurred boundary between humans and animals.
Man tends to forget that he's an animal. The only difference between vampire and the average man is that there are a few less layers of polite society between us and that animal nature. Some vampire look at humanity the same way an owl looks at a field mouse.
Dracula transforms himself at will, from human to fog, to wolf, to bat. The tie between vampire bats and human bloodsuckers had been made before, but it was Stoker's Dracula that sealed it. As creatures of the night, bats often appear in mythology and religion as enemies of light and the embodiment of evil. Yet the common vampire bat is far less forbidding than Stoker's creation. Vampire bats don't suck blood. They pierce the skin and lap up the blood as it flows. Jonathan Harker has far more to fear from the vampires that frequent Castle Dracula. One evening, he sets out to explore a remote part of the castle.
And Dracula says, whatever you do, don't go in this room. Stay out of this room. Of course, Jonathan immediately goes to this room to find out what's going on.
He falls asleep and wakes to the ultimate Victorian nightmare. It's a 20th century fantasy.
I lay quiet, looking out under my eyelashes in an agony of delightful anticipation. Lower and lower went her head. I could hear the churning sound of her tongue as it licked her teeth and lips.
And he is exquisitely raped by 3 sensuous, vibrant, powerful women, to the point where he has no choice but to give in. And any red-blooded American international man, I don't care how strong-willed he is, if he's John Wayne, he would have been putty in these brides' hands. And that's the scene that's in the book. And that sexuality, that empowerment of women, that admission by a Victorian man that these women were that powerful, and he enjoyed it, was a revelation to me. And it let me know that the sexuality that was underlying all of Dracula was potent, especially when you looked at it from the point of view of women.
Dracula enters in the nick of time.
And that line, "This man belongs to me," is all over Stoker's working notes. It's about appropriation and possession and taking somebody over, and Jonathan is a very good kind of person to be taken over because he's such an underling and a schlemiel, and he just does what he's told.
It's all just Dracula's hovering interest in Jonathan. And is he going to attack Jonathan? Is he going to penetrate Jonathan? Is he going to own him? There's this very strong homoerotic aspect to the novel. I think it's safe to say that Stoker had many anxieties about sexuality, heterosexuality and homosexuality, or at least he was very anxious about his relationships with other men. It's been said that his relationship to Henry Irving, his employer, was really the true marriage in his life.
It was a relationship that began in Ireland, Stoker's birthplace. Born in Dublin in 1847, Abraham Stoker attended Ireland's top university, Trinity College, Dublin. He courted a local girl, the young and beautiful Florence Balcom, one of the most sought-after women in all of Dublin, and he won her hand in marriage. Stoker then set his sights on another prize. While still a student at Trinity, he had written a glowing review of the performance of the English actor Henry Irving as Hamlet.
And Irving invited him over to the Shelburne Hotel so that they could talk. Irving decided to do a recitation, which was very common in those days. According to Stoker, witnessing this put him into a swoon, and he became hysterical and, fainted or nearly fainted.
Stoker wrote of this meeting,
"Soul had looked into soul. From that hour began a friendship as profound, as close, as lasting as can be between two men."
It's a love scene. It's like two people who fall in, not two people, one of them falls instantly in love with the other. He faints dead away. Now, that is not a usual response to a meeting with an important person.
Stoker even canceled his upcoming honeymoon and moved his new wife to London, where he became the business manager of Irving's theater, the Lyceum. The two men became inseparable. After performances, they hosted legendary dinner parties, with conversations often lasting well into the night. Florence and their only child, Noel, stayed at home. Irving refused to share the stage.
Stoker worshipped Irving. Stoker adored Irving. Stoker was paid to worship Irving. Everything was Irving. But I don't think it was a very intimate relationship. Irving was always master. It was an absolutely almost military relationship.
You can almost envision the Lyceum Theater as kind of Castle Dracula, in which Stoker is, trapped for decades at the beck and call of his own personal vampire in the form of Henry Irving.
A character in Stoker's novels mimics his slavish devotion to Irving. His name is Renfield, and his master is the Count. From his perch inside an English insane asylum, he awaits Dracula's call. Renfield has an appetite for blood. Flies and spiders satisfy his hunger. For the moment, Dracula has promised him larger fare. As Dracula draws near, Renfield's appetite increases. The Count has made Renfield a promise.
Lord and Master, give me eternal life.
It is a pact with the devil.
What Stoker has done that I find really very, very brilliant is that Dracula holds out a bizarre opposite promise to Christ's, eternal life. Christ's promise is eternal life in the embrace of God. Dracula's is eternal life in the embrace of Satan. And we, as readers and as film watchers, cannot help escaping the knowledge within our deep souls that we too would like to live forever.
Some people think that the relationship between Stoker and Irving was similar to that between Renfield and Count Dracula in the novel, kind of slave-master relationship.
Stoker may have looked toward Irving as the inspiration for Dracula, but he may also have had a far more bloodthirsty candidate in mind. His name, Vlad the Impaler. His homeland, Transylvania, Romania. Transylvania lies at the very heart of Eastern Europe. It is a land of dark forests and jagged mountains. Here ancient castles dot the countryside, and medieval towns appear untouched. as if time itself had come to a standstill. Though Stoker himself had never visited Transylvania, he had read about a 15th century tyrant by the name of Vlad the Impaler, or Dracula. Vlad didn't exactly impale vampires. He impaled his enemies. While his victims writhed on stakes beside him, the charming Vlad would sit down to dine. Stoker had clearly read about the historical Dracula. But how much did he really know about Vlad's exploits?
There's no evidence that Stoker knew, for example, that the historical Dracula impaled his enemies on stakes. Stoker borrowed the name Dracula from an obscure history book that said that in Romanian, Dracula means the devil. And so he crossed out the name that he originally was going to use, Count Vampire, and he changed it to Count Dracula. And that's all Stoker knew about the real Dracula.
Until the fall of communism in 1989, the novel was banned in Romania. It was deemed an example of Western decadence. Even today, Romanian feelings about Stoker's Dracula are mixed. Vlad the Impaler is often viewed as a patriot, and Dracula, a source of income.
Welcome to my house, and I pray you be seated and sup how you please. I trust, excuse me, not joined you, but I have dined already.
But when it comes to T-shirts, vodka, kitsch, Vlad the Impaler and Dracula sit side by side. And the tourists come, searching for links between fact and fiction. To them, every castle is Castle Dracula, yet none holds the unknown terrors of Stoker's mythical castle. As Jonathan ponders his fate within Castle Dracula, the Count sets sail for England. He emerges only at night to feed on the blood of sailors. It is a skipperless ship that arrives in England. Conveniently, Dracula comes ashore at Whitby, a seaside village where Hawker's fiancée, Mina, and her best friend Lucy vacation. Mina has received little word from Jonathan and impatiently awaits his return.
Minna is competent from the word go. She can type more and faster than anybody known to humankind. Lucy is the cutie pie harridan. She's the valley girl, if there were a valley girl in the story. She hasn't got a brain in her head except how pretty she could be and whether or not the three men who are all paying court to her find her as adorable as she supposes they find her.
Lucy has received 3 marriage proposals in a single week and has just settled on Arthur, an English aristocrat. But Arthur is no match for the Count. Dracula's draw is irresistible, and Lucy hears his call. One night, Mina finds her friend in the cemetery.
It seemed to me as though something dark stood behind the seat where the white figure shone and bent over it. What it was, whether man or beast, I could not tell.
Lucy has been bitten. She will never be the same again.
Dracula is an agent of releasing unbridled female sexual power. Once Lucy is bitten, for example, by the vampire, she becomes much more sexually aggressive. And in fact, when she becomes a vampire herself, she even loses her maternal instincts, which would have been the ultimate catastrophe for a good Victorian woman, and she turns on children. So Dracula converts pure, virginal, Victorian women into ravenous sexual beasts, and every good Victorian male's worst fear, if you wish.
Once bitten, Lucy is lost. Like a moth to flame, she answers Dracula's call time and time again. Soon she is bloodless and limp. The men are desperate. Lucy is deathly ill, yet her illness remains a mystery. They call in the famous Dutch doctor, Van Helsing. He suspects the worst. In desperation, he transfuses the blood of each man into Lucy's veins. But Lucy has been infected with the vampire's disease, and neither human blood nor medicine can cure her. Bowing to the inevitable, Lucy dies. When the men next see her, she is wandering at night through the cemetery, baby in her arms, blood dripping from her mouth. She has become one of the undead, a vampire, and her bloodlust knows no bounds.
It is the vampire's proximity to blood that I think gives it its real mythic power, because blood is the ultimate human symbol. It stands for life itself. It is the life force. The sight of blood also represents death. It represents all of our emotions and passions, sexuality, anger. It represents our ties to the distant past.
This dark world has been made accessible, even hip, to millions through the writings of Anne Rice and others. But for those who participate in the vampire sacrament, Dracula is anything but bloodless entertainment. Vlad and Skye call themselves vampires.
You see someone, you say, it's an attractive person. We'd like to see what they taste like.
It's a taboo for others, but for us, it's natural, it's real, and it's the most beautiful exchange that you can ever have with each other.
Well, it also represents the unknown. People are afraid of what they don't know. People are afraid of what they don't see and what they have not seen.
Some vampires fear the rest of us humans even more than we fear them.
Anonymity is protection, and protection is life. And I have no desire to experience a stake through the heart. Will it kill me? Yeah, it'll kill anybody. It's not the way I want to die.
Val believes she has a biological need for blood. Her donors, or vessels, give willingly. As far as quantity, it's the quality that counts.
This is not the Red Cross. I don't need a pint. The quantity of blood a vampire needs to salve hunger is actually very small. It's only a little bit more than a tablespoon. Now, that doesn't mean if more blood is available, I won't drink it. It simply means that I'm not hungry after a very, very small amount. Everyone has their own preferences. It's like that steak, medium rare or well done. My preference is actually AB negative. It has a unique taste that's just a tad sweeter than the average. And one of my vessels is AB negative and a diabetic, so it's sort of like biting into a candy apple. It's an act that there's really very few examples for. It's far more intimate than sex. It's very difficult to make someone understand what it's like to feel two heartbeats that sync as one.
Dracula's blood now courses through Lucy's veins. She is bound to him for eternity. Lucy is one of the undead. Her only salvation, a stake through the heart. On what should have been Lucy and Arthur's wedding night, the men return to her crypt.
Van Helsing brings his guys into the tomb. They're now absolutely convinced that Lucy is a vampire because they do see her prowling around, vamping children. So they say a lot of prayers and read the Bible, and Arthur, her husband-to-be, stakes her with the movements of a Thor. He becomes this great god pounding into her. And everybody says this is sort of a typical nightmarish imagination of a Victorian honeymoon. So they cut off her head and fill her mouth with garlic. And it's a very frightening scene because it's obviously reminiscent to any woman of a gang rape or even any sort of surgical mutilation of a woman, which they justify by spirituality and reading these common prayers.
It will be a blessed hand that shall strike the blows.
Van Helsing is a philosopher and a doctor and a lawyer. Dr. Seward is a doctor, and Arthur is an English lord. So together they represent all the rising professions. And they kind of brainwash each other.
Driving a stake into them to somehow destroy them is such a guy thing, you know. It's staking somebody out is sort of the ultimate humiliation and the ultimate punishment, and it's also very sexual. So these men are all standing around gangbanging Lucy by driving this big stake through her together so they can feel better about themselves. And I love Lucy's revenge on them. She, you know, that even in her wedding gown, being, you know, 5 days dead, she is more beautiful than anything that her husband has ever seen.
Like a lot of middle-class Victorian men, Bram Stoker was suspicious of the new woman.
We see in Dracula, I think, Stoker just giving condescending lip service to this, especially in the character of Mina. She can type, she can do shorthand. What an admirable creature. And I don't think this is what new women really had in mind as emancipation. I think Stoker would be horrified that anyone would think of him as misogynistic. And yes, I think he was misogynistic.
While Dracula wreaks havoc in London, Mina's fiancé, Harker, escapes the castle and returns to England. And not a moment too soon. Even as the men search for Dracula's hidden lairs in London, Dracula has already found Mina's.
The mist grew thicker and thicker with the white energy of boiling water. Things began to whirl through my brain, just as the cloudy column was now whirling in the room. And in my dream I must have fainted, for all became black darkness. The last conscious effort which imagination made was to show me a livid white face bending over me out of the mist. I must be careful of such dreams, for they would unseat one's reason if there were too much of them.
Night after night, Dracula feasts on Mina. Until one evening, the men enter her room and discover Dracula. He is in bed with Mina. Jonathan lies unconscious next to her. Dracula has torn open his chest. As the blood flows, he forces Mina to drink.
The attitude of the two had a terrible resemblance to a child forcing a kitten's nose into a saucer of milk to compel it to drink.
Once you have drunk from the vampire's blood, if you're a woman, it's like an elixir and you become this radiant other person and you're ruddy and energized and you order men around.
Dracula's appeal to women runs deep. James Harker calls the night in 1977 when he watched Frank Langella as Dracula seduce Mina on stage. He tears open his chest and Mina drinks.
The audience is a collective gasp holding their breath, and the curtain drops and the lights come up And I'm sitting there behind a row of women probably from New Jersey or Queens, big hair, I mean a whole bunch of them. And this woman in this very loud voice said, "I would rather spend one night with Dracula dead than the rest of my life with my husband alive." And I went, wow, that's the power of Dracula. The men get out their swords and their guns and their crucifixes and their stakes. The women put on their sexiest nightgown.
In the book, the men must save Mina from eternal life as vampire. The race is on. For Victorian readers, this was a classic Gothic scene. Morally upright men pursue the evil, corrupt monster. But today, many readers sympathize with Dracula rather than his hunters. He's exotic. They're mundane.
Dracula, I believe, was very misunderstood. He was cursed. He had to feed off the blood of the living. And there was a lot of conflict in his life.
He was this tragic character, and everybody felt kind of like sorry for him and hated him at the same time. And that was a turn-on.
They called themselves vampires, but they haunt nightclubs more often than cemeteries.
For me, the whole scene of vampirism, it's fun, it's breaking taboos, it's being different, it's being who you are.
I can shun the mundane world, I can leave job and school behind, and I can be this. I don't have to just be, Mr. Mundane or Ms. Mundane.
The vampire way of life is the total expression of freedom.
Doing whatever you want to do when you feel it's right.
We're not all bad. We're friendly. We don't bite. Ow!
They may call themselves vampires, but lots of things have changed since Dracula's day. Fangs, for instance. At $85 a pair, anyone can wear them. Or not.
I don't wear fangs because they make me drool. The cat ate my fangs.
Garlic?
I'm Sicilian. What do you think?
Crosses?
I can look at them without, burning to dust.
Sunlight?
I don't spend much time out in the sun. You can probably tell from my complexion.
You won't see me down on Malibu Beach, sipping a Kahlua out in the sun. That's just not my thing.
The vampire, once considered evil incarnate, has been reinvented as an icon of alienation.
Dracula has taken on all kinds of sympathetic qualities in the late 20th century that I think Bram Stoker would have been just aghast over. And this idea that Dracula was something to become or to emulate, I don't think Bram Stoker would have known what planet he had just stepped onto.
Modern-day vampires have far fewer restrictions than the 19th century variety. Dracula lives in fear of garlic, crosses, and daylight. And to make matters worse, he is only allowed to sleep on native Transylvanian soil. So he transported boxes of earth to England and hid them in key locations. This earth is the key to Dracula's survival in England. If the men can destroy his resting places, the Count must flee to Transylvania. As they locate the boxes, Van Helsing sterilizes the earth inside by blessing it with communion wafers. He compares their battle against the vampire to a holy war.
To fail here is not mere life or death. It's that we become as him. That we henceforth become foul things of the night, preying on the bodies and the souls of those we love best.
This is not merely a battle for Mina's life. It is a fight for the very soul of England.
Dracula can be read as a novel about British feelings of supremacy at the end of the 19th century, coupled with a distrust and a hatred and a fear of foreigners. There was quite a flux of immigration into England from Eastern Europe in the 1880s and 1890s, and there were a lot of people who resented this. Dracula comes in, he pollutes the good English bloodlines, he threatens the very nature of English civilization, and so you have to get these very morally upright representatives of England and Western Europe to line up against him.
Once Mina has shared Dracula's blood, she is corrupted. To protect her against further advances by Dracula, Van Helsing places a communion wafer against her forehead. It sears into her flesh. Mina has been polluted by the vampire's blood. But Victorians were concerned about a different and equally forbidding blood disease, syphilis. In Dracula, Stoker created a metaphor for this epidemic. Syphilis became the vampire's plague.
Syphilis really was kind of the AIDS of the Victorian era, and I don't think it's a coincidence that the AIDS epidemic has coincided with this extraordinary renaissance of vampire literature and vampire films, and once again this idea of a blood-borne contagion.
As if to exorcise the bad blood from England, Stoker sends Dracula fleeing back to Transylvania. The men and Mina in hot pursuit.
Stoker, as if he was a major film producer or film director, organizes the chase so that there are three vectors of interest. There's the coach, there's the horseman, and there's Dr. Van Helsing with Mina. The three of them are converging on Dracula's castle. The sun is going down, the wolves are howling.
Suddenly you're in this John Ford Western in this mountain shootout.
As the sun just goes down, the men converge, Dracula leaps up.
And Quincy Morris drives him through the heart with a Bowie knife.
And I didn't make this up, I wish I had, but there's a look of triumph in Dracula's eyes at the sunset. And then they see him getting that good old look of peace on his face and crumbling to dust. But really, as one critic has said, he's probably not crumbling to dust at all. He's just turning to moonbeams the way vampires can and sort of floating away when they think they've killed him, because you obviously can't kill Dracula with a Bowie knife. That's silly.
All these years we believe Dracula was staked out with a big stake and a big hammer. And that's not true. And I would ask people, okay, you know Dracula, how did Dracula die? Oh, well, they stake him out with a big stake and, drive it. No. Dracula was killed by a Texan with a Bowie knife. And they would look at me like I was nuts.
Stake or no stake, Dracula crumbles into dust. The curse is lifted. Stoker, on the other hand, met with less success. When Dracula came out in 1897, it sold reasonably well. People saw it simply as a good horror story. But it brought Stoker neither financial nor professional acclaim. Only Stoker's mother recognized it as a great novel.
My dear, it is splendid. 1,000 miles beyond anything you have written. No book since Mrs. Shelley's Frankenstein, or indeed any other at all, has come near yours in originality or terror. Poe is nowhere.
But profits from Dracula were minimal. And soon after Henry Irving died in 1905, Stoker suffered his first of many strokes. Still, Stoker continued to write, including a reminiscence of his relationship with Irving. In 1912, Bram Stoker died quietly at home. He was 65. Contrary to Stoker's final years, Dracula ends on a lighter note with a journal entry from Jonathan. It is years past the epic battle with the Count, and he has returned to the castle with Mina. They have brought their young son, Quincy.
It was almost impossible to believe that the things which we had seen with our own eyes and heard with our own ears were living truths. Every trace that had been was blotted out.
Or was it?
Obviously, baby Quincy is supposed to have all the blood of all the brave men who hunted the vampire, but his mother, Mina, drank the blood of Dracula, who in turn drank the blood of Lucy, who drank through blood transfusion the blood of Dr. Seward and Van Helsing and Arthur and Quincy Morris. In fact, everybody's blood is in that kid, except his father's, Jonathan Harker. So I'm certain he's a little vampire baby.
Whether reborn as baby Quincy or reincarnated through endless celluloid adaptations, Dracula endures.
For every new film, for every new generation, Drac can change and shift, and he can give you what you want. He knows how to play a crowd, and he's been playing us all, for a century now, and I think he'll go on playing us for the next century.
Count Dracula will outlive us all, wandering through our nightmares, revealing our innermost fears and our deepest desires.